the basic steps that you can take to learn more about how to research your house. These are the same steps that I take on a daily basis. I do a lot of research in my work. Most recently, I've been doing a lot of work on Munjoy Hill and in the Bayside neighborhoods, and then we recently did a lot of research on Portland's Chinese community in the 1920s that we recently posted about, including a Chinese family who lived in Woodfords Corner and had a laundry, which I will mention a little bit later when I show you some images. So why should you go ahead and research your old house or building? It's great to be able to know who owned or lived or worked in your house or building. Lots of people just want to know when it was built and how old it is. Some people get really excited because they're doing a building project in their house and they'd like to know what it looked like originally, and maybe they're thinking about taking off their vinyl siding and they want to know what wood trim might have been underneath their house. So there's all different things that and different reasons why people look at researching their house. The first step that you should do is find out what's already known. There's no sense in recreating the wheel, right? There are several different building databases in Portland. I'm going to talk most specifically about Portland. There's our office. We have some street files, not as much for off-peninsula neighborhoods as we have for peninsula neighborhoods, but we do have some. And we also have some street files on some of the surrounding communities where we've done survey work. There's also, if you happen to live in a registered neighborhood, if you, there might be a National Register nomination form that might talk to you a little bit about your house. The city's assessor databases have some limited information. And then the state maintains an online database called CARMA, C-A-R-M-A. And that is a GIS-based database where you can go in and you can see here, there's an image of what that looks like on the screen. And every house that's been documented becomes populated within the GIS database with, I think they look like Monopoly houses. They even have kind of colors like Monopoly houses. So the little red houses that you can see, those are buildings that are on the National Register. Likewise, the kind of the pinkish purple areas are also National Register districts. If it's a yellow building, that's a building that's been determined eligible to be on the National Register of Historic Places. Gray buildings are not eligible to be on the National Register. And the green buildings, which you can see a lot of in this image, those are buildings that are currently in the process of being surveyed and documented and processed through the state office. I've zoomed in a little bit on the Woodfords Corner neighborhood in Back Cove and Rosemont. You can see that there's been a lot of survey work in the neighborhoods around Woodfords Corner. A few years ago, maybe 4 years ago now, we did the Oakdale neighborhood, which runs between Noyes and Falmouth Street. 2 summers ago, we did the small neighborhood off Preble Street Extension, Deerfield. I think this, I can't remember the other street that's in there, just next to the Hannaford Plaza. We've done most of Deering Highlands, and we've done some work out in Nason's Corner, but very recently there's been a project through the Maine Department of Transportation that's doing documentation along Brighton Avenue. So there's many more houses in the neighborhood that have been documented. There's also, years and years ago, I did the work on the properties on Walton Street that you can see in this image that have been determined eligible for the National Register. I will just let you know that although it doesn't show up on here, when we did the Deering Highlands work, we proposed that the Deering Highlands was eligible as a National Register Historic District, and we did get concurrence from the state that it could be a potential district. That documentation, if you were to go in and click on one of those houses, what you can bring up is the state survey form. That includes some general data on the property name and the address. It includes some architectural data and a photo, a current photo or recent photo of the house. And then it also has some historical data, and that varies a little bit by who is doing the input and what the project is. So sometimes you'll find either a documented or estimated date of construction. In the case of this particular property, which is actually in Westbrook, they knew the date of major alterations. The architect, well, I shouldn't say it was an architect, it was the artist that did significant work on the interior of the house. This property is actually listed on the National Register of Historic Places. So there was a little bit more information known about it. It has interior murals. So hopefully you can find a little bit of base survey information by going to some of those resources. But if you can't, the next step is to do some deed research. And we are very fortunate, if most of you are thinking about doing research on properties in Cumberland County, that all of the Cumberland County Registry of Deeds are online, which is wonderful in this time of COVID, and you can't actually go to the Registry of Deeds. So we're very fortunate. Not all counties in Maine have done this extensive amount of documentation. Many of the counties only go back to the 60s or 70s and 1960s or 70s, which isn't particularly helpful when you're trying to research a historic property. So this is the first page in the Cumberland County Registry of Deeds. It has several drop-down boxes. The first one on the left, you can see it says recorded land. That's where you're looking for actual physical deeds, the text deeds. The other option is recorded land plans, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. And then you can do searching by different types. So you can input a name, which you know your own name. So you could insert your own name if you're looking up your own property. You can also do, the other one that I use most often is volume search. I'm often researching someone else's property, and you can obtain the volume, which is the book and page number that it's recorded on from the assessors in most communities. So I often start with volume search. But irregardless, when you start with your name search, eventually you're going to have to go to a volume search, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So if you were starting with a name search, you would put in your last and first name, which I have done here. I'm going to use one building in your neighborhood as an example throughout the presentation tonight. This is actually a property. They're very involved in our organization, and they recently had a new marker installed on their property. So we had done a lot of this research. So it was a great opportunity to do that. So the owner in this case is Nancy Montgomery. So I typed in Montgomery and Nancy, and a series of deeds came up. And I happen to know that this particular deed in 1989 is from when they purchased the property. The two sources of information that you're really looking for are what is the date that the deed was filed and what is the location within the Registry of Deeds. So it's in book 8,890 and page 71. On this, there are two tabs here. This is the Details tab. If you click on View Images, it will bring up a second window that will show you the actual deed that you searched for. And this has several pieces of information that you need to be looking for. It will have who is selling the building. That will be the first item of information and the first name. The second will be who they are selling it to, in this case, Nancy Montgomery and her husband, Jack. Within the description, you always want to make sure that you're researching the right property and that it's describing the right thing. In this case, it's a parcel of land with buildings on the easterly side of Deering Avenue. And then the fourth item to always be looking for on a deed is a paragraph or a couple of sentences, usually near the end of the description, Sometimes it's a separate paragraph, sometimes buried within the text. But it will say something about being the same premises that was conveyed to the grantors, meaning Mr. and Mrs. Sear, by deed of, and in this case, Beverly Morrison, in August 29th, 1984, and recorded in the Cumberland County Registry of Deeds, book 6549, page 257. What that's telling you is that is the deed that gave the parcel and land and house to the Sears. And so that is the next deed that you want to go back to find out who Beverly acquired the house from. And that's when you switch to do a volume search. So in this case, you would change the drop down to volume search, and you would take that book and page number that was referenced in that last line of the previous deed, and it will come up in the search. And so here we have, it says that this was Beverly being sold to Peter and Patricia, and then you can go and click view images, and that deed will come up, and then you just keep going backwards. And I usually keep a list that looks a little something like this. I keep a line or a column with the dates, the book and pages that I record, and the owners and who they're selling it to. And that's how you can slowly go back in time, deed by deed, to get to where you think the original owner is. Now, in this case, what you're looking for is a point where there's no building included, where they're selling a lot of land. And in this case, that happened in 1892 with the sale to Mitchell. That deed references only a parcel and no building. And then in 1894, there is a building that is sold. I'm going to talk a little bit about, in this case, the house was named for the Center family rather than Mr. Mitchell, because Mr. Mitchell did not live in the parcel, did not live in this house. I mentioned when we first started that the first drop-down menu gets you to recorded land plans. And particularly for neighborhoods off peninsula, I would encourage you to always do a land plan search, because subdivision records, very early subdivisions as well as contemporary subdivisions, are recorded in the Registry of Deeds. So instead of putting in your last name, you just put in the name of your street without street or avenue, just the name. So you would go recorded land plan, name, Revere, and it will bring up any plans that have to do with Revere. In this particular case, I was researching Orland Avenue, and so when I typed in Orland, I got this, which is the Fessenden Park Extension subdivision from 1915, and it shows the original layout of lots, and you can even see it shows a couple of houses on Longfellow Street that were built when this was recorded in 1915. I'm going to stop here and ask if anybody has any questions about doing deed searches. Anything that I wasn't clear about? No? Okay. I'll take questions at the end too, but it might be easier as we go section by section. I think it's always good to check your work as you go along and make sure you're recording the same, the right house, because sometimes as parcels are subdivided, it can become confusing. Many cases, a dad will take the farm and subdivide it amongst his children. Sometimes the description says to go to the third tree on the left by the stone wall. The tree, the wall, none of it is there. You can't figure out, am I dealing with the right property? It becomes very confusing. So I always think it's important to double check your work, and there are a couple of ways that you can do that. And one is through the use of historic maps. There are a lot of historic maps. There are more for the city of Portland, but even some of the surrounding communities have some pretty good ranges, maps to help you kind of date your house within a certain range. And certainly if you have an older house, like a house built in the late 1700s, historic maps can really be helpful because there aren't other written records like street directories that can help you pinpoint who may have been owning or living in your house at the time. On the left-hand side, there is a map of Cumberland County, which is from 1857. And you can see that most of the buildings that are shown are just little squares. They don't differentiate the house shape or size, but they do have the last name and usually the first and maybe middle initial of the owner, which can help you track down who the owners were as you're doing your deed research. It's always good if you get to the 1850s in a deed to take a look at the 1857 map and make sure you're in the right spot. Likewise, there's a map from about 20 years later in 1871. This is in the Atlas of Cumberland County. There are maps for all of the communities in Cumberland County, as well as sometimes if you are researching a building in a village or a concentrated area, more zoomed in maps that have greater detail, which is what is actually being shown here. The map on the right shows just a blur of lines around the village of Little Falls on the Presumscot River. And actually, it has a very similar inset map like the one in 1857, which kind of zooms in on Little Falls. There are also maps from a company called the Sanborn Insurance Company. These were actually developed to provide insurance rates, and they document not only the shape of the building, the materials that the building made, the number of stories in the building, and they're very, very detailed, including bays and porches. So they can be really useful. They don't have a lot of ownership information, but they're really good for tracking physical changes that have happened to your property. There are Sanborn insurance maps for Portland from 1886 and 1896. There are some for Deering in the 1896 book, a little bit less so from the 1886 book. There's a 1909 series and a 1950s series. So they can be very helpful in tracking changes to your building. These are particularly useful for some of the businesses because if you have a commercial building, they do often own the commercial or industrial building. There are also maps from the U.S. Geological Service. They're a little less helpful. They do just show when you're in a rural area that there was physically a building there, which can be helpful if you're in a rural neighborhood looking for an older property where there isn't a lot of maps. There's a 1914 map of the city of Portland called the Richards Atlas, which is available through the Portland Public Library website. And then they also have a map, which you can see on the bottom left here, which is called the Goodwin Map of 1882. The Goodwin Map was done for the city assessor's office, and it has a footprint of every building and it lists an owner for every building. So these are really helpful in determining ownership of buildings, unlike some of the other maps where they don't always have a name associated with them. These are available in two places. The Goodwin Maps of Portland are available through the Portland Public Library's Digital Commons website, and they are also in the Registry of Deeds. But it's a little bit easier to use the ones that are on the library site, so I'd encourage you to go there. Just some additional Cumberland County atlases and maps. I would point out that if you are researching something in the Woodfords Corner neighborhood, it can be a challenge because that has been 3 towns. It has been either part of the city of Westbrook, part of the town or city of Deering, and then of course part of the city of Portland. So sometimes you need to be looking for the Westbrook map, sometimes you're looking for the Deering map, and sometimes you're looking for a Portland map. Within the Registry of Deeds, everything is listed as Portland now, but sometimes, particularly when you're doing census work, sometimes it will come up under the town or city of Deering. Some maps that I really love, and there's a great one for Deering, and I would encourage you all to look at that if you have a house that you think would have been in Deering in 1886, and that's the bird's eye map of Deering. There is a version, I believe, available at Maine Historical Society, and a version at, I think, the Library of Congress has another version. This map, although it's not zoomed in really well here, has a drawing of every house. They would send draftsmen out into the field to do drawings of the houses. Those would then go back to the map maker, either in New York or Chicago, wherever they were doing this work, Philadelphia. And then they would create these bird's eye maps, and they are incredibly accurate. You can usually see that, you know, the doors on the left-hand side of the house, there's 2 windows to the right of the door, and it's a 1.5-story house, and it has a small L on the back. I mean, they're incredibly detailed. And they're really wonderful to look at because you really get a sense of the place. There's a bird's eye map of Peaks Island. There's also one of Portland that was done right after the Great Fire of 1866, which is a really interesting map to look at. I mentioned some of the atlases have kind of these zoomed in maps of more built up communities. So there's one here on the left of the village of Gorham, and then on the right, some Standish and Windham and Gorham communities. Oh, here's that bird's eye map again. I've zoomed in a little bit on the bird's eye map. The property that I started doing the deed research on was not here in 1886. It was actually built on the site of this estate right here in this lower left-hand corner where you can see the red circle. I'll just orientate you on the map a little bit. Forest Avenue moves from the lower left to the kind of upper center of the right-hand side of the screen. The large oval near the top of the screen, top left of the screen, that's approximately where Deering High School and the athletic fields are today. This was a trotting park, and you can see there were 2 railroad lines that were going through Woodfords Corner at this period. The current and existing railroad line, which kind of cuts through the Deering Highlands neighborhood, as well as a line that cut through the Oakdale neighborhood and ran behind where Oddfellows Hall is today, and then met up with the other line and continued out towards Morrell's Corner.
Julie, what year is that map again?
That is 1886.
Okay.
I believe that's right. Let me click back. Yeah, 1886. So I mentioned there was that 1914 map that's available through the public library. It's called the Richards Map. And that's the first time that the house that Nancy Montgomery owns that I did the deed research for, it's the first time their house appears on the map. And you can see it here, the second house in over from Ashmont on Deering Avenue. The 1914 map is great because it has these little footprints. You can see the little bays and where there might be a turret on a house. It shows outbuildings, so buildings that have an X through them. Those are the barns or outbuildings, garages. The buildings that are shown in pink are brick buildings. And then you can also see near the upper middle of the screen, there are some yellow buildings that have like dots in them. Those are greenhouses.
Wow.
You can learn lots of really interesting things about some of the houses. And then if you look along the streets, you can see that in front of each house, they give the street number, which is really helpful. It doesn't always coincide with the current street number because the streets have been renumbered very early on in the 20th century. There was some street renumbering that happened in the city of Portland. And then of course, when E911 system went in, buildings were renumbered. But they do coincide with the street numbers from this time period that are located in the street directories, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. So it's always good if you can find your house on this map to see what your old house number was, because you're going to need it for a couple of other things. Any questions about historic maps? No? Okay. As an architect, I have to encourage you to look at your building and see what your building might be telling you about its history. That isn't always 100% reliable, because buildings, like people, change over time. And much like we do today when we look at programs like home, on HGTV, and we want to update our buildings, our ancestors did that in their buildings as well. And so they changed a building according to changing tastes. And of course, as new owners moved into buildings, they may have made some changes to accommodate their families. I will point out that if you come across a property that's been in a family for a long period of time, and you can identify that there have been some changes made to your building, I would encourage you to, as you're doing research, to look at the vital statistics of the members of the family. Because what we see in a lot of properties that are owned long-term by family is that when a son gets married, or maybe when a daughter inherits a house and moves her family into the house, that's when changes make. And so sometimes you can tie changes to a property to when there is either a death in the family and an inheritance, or a marriage and changes in family size and in ownership. The building, as an architect, know a lot about the different styles of buildings, but I recognize that even I don't know a lot about them, and certainly don't expect the average person to know how to identify the various styles of the house. There are a number of style guides that are out there. I will just put a plug in that my Bible, and the one I have multiple copies of, one of which is held together by duct tape, is A Field Guide to American Houses by Virginia Savage McAllister. There's an updated version of that which talks a little bit more about modern houses and houses built after World War II. But if you can get your hand on any copy of that book, or any volume of that book, I'd encourage you to take a look at it. It's really useful because it talks a little bit about each style, what the identifying features are of each style, both in text and visually. It demonstrates what the features are, and talks a little bit about the variations within the building, and it can help you identify your building. So in this case, the building on the right is a small home that Greater Portland Landmarks actually acquired when the Holiday Inn by the Bay was going to be constructed. This was going to be demolished for the site of the hotel. The hotel gave it to Landmarks, and we moved it from Spring Street downtown to the West End and had it restored, and it's had a series of owners since then. It really has a number of character defining features which you could compare with the style guide drawing on the left. It has these really delicate but noticeable verge boards, which is the wood trim under the peak of the gable roof. You have the pointed arch and the wood detailing over the pointed arch, and a lot of the scroll work and cut and molding, and stained glass and diamond patterns of the windows that are very typical of the style. And with each period of construction, it gives an approximation of the date when this house style was popular. So if you can't find any deed research on your house, you couldn't find any your house on any maps, you could at least date your house to a period of time using the style of it. One thing I forgot to mention when I was talking about deeds is that in the Great Depression, a lot of homes went through foreclosure. And sometimes you can run up against a brick wall. As you're going through creating your list, if you get to Maine Savings Bank and you can't find how Maine Savings Bank acquired the building, say in like 1932. And if you just typed in Maine Savings Bank, you will get like 100 pages of mortgages and deeds that Maine Savings Bank has their name on. And there's no way you could ever go through them to find where the mortgage was that they foreclosed upon. So particularly in the 1920s and 1930s, sometimes you will hit a brick wall. But there are ways to get around that. And if you can't get around it, send me an email and I may be able to help you. Also in the style guide, it talks a little bit about the different types of features, and then it will give you some examples of different houses across the country that were done in that style, which can help you as you're looking at your property. Another thing to look for is historic images of your house. This is really helpful from the perspective of trying to see what changes may have been made to your house. And we are really fortunate in the city of Portland that in 1924, the tax assessors went through and documented all of the tax-paying properties in the city. So they didn't do schools, they didn't do churches, but all of the commercial buildings and residences were done. Those are available on the Maine Historical Society's Maine Memory Network. You can click a button on that front page that says the 1924 tax photos. You can go in and just put in your street name. You can put in your street number. But again, if your house number has changed, it might not get you the right house. So I always encourage people to go by the street name, unless you live on Congress Street, because you don't want to wade through the hundreds of homes that have a Congress Street address. There are some other places where you might be able to find a historic photo. What I'd like to point out is we have some photos in our office, not a lot. Most of our photography is from the 1970s, which isn't particularly historic. So if you're really looking for an early photo, we're probably not your best bet. I will say that if you are on Facebook, you really need to check out this Facebook group called Portland, Maine History, 1876 to the present, rather. Facebook has a lot of negative aspects, but I think one thing that it's really good at is this crowdsourcing of information. People can post photos, the moderators post photos, and then it becomes, in a way, sort of an oral history collector as people talk about and reminisce about the photographs and give information about, oh, you know, my uncle lived in that house, or this was my grandmother's house, and she worked at such. It just becomes a great collector of history, and they have at least 3,000 photographs of Portland. They're subdivided into folders, so you can look just at Deering, you can look at the waterfront. If you're interested in streetcars and transportation and trains, you can just go into that folder. There's also a folder of historic maps, and so it's broken down a little bit, but you can lose a lot of time looking at photos, but it's a great source for photos that most people don't think about. This is an example of that 1924 tax photos that I talked about. This is the house that we did the deed search for at 447 Deering Street. In addition to a photo, the tax assessors also have some tax information that they gathered. They write down the owner's name. In this case, they actually also, the typed name was the name of the owner in 1924, and then at a certain point after it was sold, one of the assessors came back in and crossed that out and wrote in by hand this Otis Sproul name, which was a later owner. And we were talking as we were starting this meeting, so some of you may have not heard the conversation, but if a building had apartments, it would say how many, in this case, it talks about how many tenants, and it will say how many rooms. So if there were 3 units, it would say 3, the number of room in each unit. And if it's a rental, they will put in how much the rent was. So we were talking about how interesting it would be if you're a renter in Portland to see what your apartment rented for in 1924 versus what you're paying today, because it would be a big difference. It does have a line at the top that talks about the age of the property. I would say if your house was built within 10 to 15 years of 1924, the tax assessor may have a fairly correct date, but a lot of times they put 50 plus. Sometimes they put old, which is not particularly helpful. But if you have a house built in 1915, they probably might actually know that it was built in 1915. And then there's a little bit more information about the materials of the house that they used in their evaluation. And then usually there's a second page attached to this that was the flip side of the document, and it will have a little footprint of the building, and we'll talk about the size, and it will note if there was a garage or an outbuilding as well. Now, this building at 447 Deering Street, you can see it has a lovely a turret on the corner there. It has a big gable in the back, and it has kind of a swooping roof that comes down over the front and engages that front porch. Whoops. So if we were to think about what kind of building this was stylistically, from our deed search, we know it was built in the 1890s, which falls between both the period of the Queen Anne period and the shingle style. It has the turret or tower, that corner tower that's associated with the Queen Anne style. But it also is borrowing a little bit from the shingle style in this kind of having the roof come down and encompass the front porch, which you can see here with this John Calvin Stevens house, which is out off Brighton Avenue. Oops.
So Julie, what would you call that house then when it's got a mix of different types of styles?
Yeah, so in the state of Maine, they allow you to, if you're doing a survey and submitting a formal survey form, you assign a primary style, which in this case I think would be Queen Anne. It shares more character, I think, with the Queen Anne style, but then it has a secondary influence, which would be the shingle style. So that my favorite, but that's all fun to do. But I love the next part, which is going a little bit deeper and finding out about the people that lived in your house. You've identified them through deed research, but how do you really get to know who they are other than just a name? And so there are a variety of ways that you can learn more about who the people were that lived in your house, what they were doing, and a little bit more about their lives. You can look at street census records, where you can learn more about their occupation, where they worked. There are cemetery records and vital records, which will help you identify when they were born, when they died, and when they were married, how many times they were married, how many children they had, how many children they had that survived. Because once you get into pre-World War II, you'll see families had a lot of children that didn't make it into adulthood. There's also military records that are available online that can be really helpful, whichever generation, whichever war that you're interested in looking at. And there are also biographies and town histories. And as I mentioned, a lot of alterations happen to houses, particularly in rural areas, around changes in ownership or marriages and deaths. And so I think doing this vital records research and learning more about the family histories and dates can help you identify why some changes may have happened to your house. There are some houses that are very colonial and very early houses, and you'll go into them and they look Greek Revival on the interior. That's because when the family, when the house turned over to a new family, to a different generation in the 1820s or 30s, they completely redid the house. And so the interior of the house may not match the actual exterior or the original date of the house. Talk a little bit about street directories first. There's a fairly good collection of street directories at the Maine Historical Society. During COVID, that's a little bit more challenging to access. We have some directories at our office, but I tend to use the online ones very much so. In the last year, I've been mostly using the online directories. Although I'm still a diehard, I'd rather flip pages in a book than pages on a on a computer screen, but I'm getting better about using them on a computer screen. Ancestry.com, which is generally a paid site that you can use if you go to a library, but because many libraries are closed right now, the state of Maine does have free at-home access to Ancestry. So if you have already done some deed research on your house and you just like to learn more information and do some of this street directory or census work, and it's wintertime and you don't want to go out of the house anyways, even if there was no COVID, now's a great time to use Ancestry and take advantage of some of their resources, online resources, and their search capability. These are actually from the City of Westbrook directories, and they're from the same year, 1953, but I wanted to show you that within street directories, there are multiple sections, and the two that I use the most are the alphabetical listing. So you can look someone up by their last name. In this case, this is my family. This is the Larry family. And you can look up by the last name. I would say that if you have a last name like mine, which can be spelled in different ways or misspelled in different ways, you always want to look up how they, the alternative. So like if your last name was Olson with an E-N, you always want to make sure that you look up Olson with an O-N, because sometimes it just gets translated. And then the other section is by street name. And this is where in Portland, that 1914 map can come in really handy, and some of the other maps that actually will list the street number, because you can go to your street. In this case, in Westbrook, my family lived on CB Street, and then you can go to the street number. In this case, it was 82 CB Street, and you can find out the name of the owner. As this is a later directory and phone numbers, there were telephones at this point, you can also see that they had a telephone and what their telephone number was in this case. In Portland, early directories, and by early I mean pre-1900, have this second section by street. You can only look up by the owner name alphabetically. The other thing that you can use to find out more information is the U.S. Census. The U.S. Census documents are available on Ancestry, but they're also available on a site that's free called Family Search. Either one is come up usually with the same answers. They're both of their search engines work easily. Census data is different depending which decade you're looking at. Pre-1850 rather, census data isn't particularly helpful. They only record the male head of household, and then they don't record any of the other names of who was living in the house. They only do how many males and females, and then they categorize them by are they children under the age of, I think it's 10 or 12, and then they do like 25 to 35, 35 to 45, and then over 45. So it's not particularly helpful in learning a lot more about the family itself.
The free male, free female, or is about slavery? What is that?
Yeah, so in the census at this point, there was still slavery in the United States. So they're recording, in this case, this is free females and free males. And then they had a separate schedule that was the slave schedule. And that is also available online, but it's a little bit harder to find the ones from Maine and the later years when slavery had been abolished in Maine. They only did slave schedules for slave states, obviously. So for 1860, even though the emancipation had not happened yet, when you go to look, it's just like Tennessee, Maryland, Virginia. It was all of the slave states, not any of the northern states. As you move forward in time into decades more closer to the one we're in now, you get a little bit better information. I'm trying to figure out, I can't even see on my screen which year this is, but this is in the this is 1920s. 1920s, this is a period where there's a lot of immigration happening in the country, and the census is trying to record some of that information. So you can see in the middle of the screen, it's talking about nativity and mother tongue. So they were recording where people were born and what language they spoke. There's also a column for citizenship. Are they aliens? Are they naturalized? When were they naturalized? When did they immigrate to this country? And then they also have kind of the standard information about name, the relationship within the household, the ages of those people being recorded on the census, and then if they had an occupation, that is listed. So I've just blown up this one again. This is some family members living in Westbrook. You can see that in this case, Sarah is the top line. She's identified as the head of household, and she was living with her two daughters, Ethel and Bessie. You can see this first column here, there's an O, and you can see if you go a little bit further down, one of their neighbors, they have an R. This is that they owned the house versus they were renters. And as you go a little bit further, you can see this next column here with all of the W's. This identifies that their race. So you will have, generally speaking, white for W, B for black, M for mulatto. Then you have the age, and then you have their marital status. In this case, we can see that Sarah is a widow and her two daughters are unmarried, even though, and they were here ages 33 and 45, and that they were all from Maine. But I did just want to point out that their neighbor, this is where you can see they're gathering some of that immigration information. Their neighbor, Edward McKay, was born in Scotland and came to the United States in 1907. That's right there by those red arrows. And then if you follow the line across, in this case, their mom at her age at 68 was not working, but the two daughters, they both worked, it says here, the paper mill in Westbrook, but we know that that was S.D. Warren. In fact, I knew Betsy, I didn't know Ethel. One of them worked in the mill and the other was a stenographer and worked in the offices at S.D. Warren all of her life. This is the last census that has been released. It was a big celebration when the 1940 census came out. I'm really looking forward to the 1950 census coming out in a couple of years. This one similarly has a little bit of information about immigration, but what they were really capturing in this period was that Americans started to move a lot more. It wasn't people living in the same community for long periods of time. And so in this case, they tried to capture that movement between 1930 rather, and 1940 by asking where people lived 5 years earlier instead of where they were 10 years earlier. So that's actually included in here. There's a similar information about what their occupation was, what their age, were they singled and widowed, lots of similar information. And then on the far left-hand side of both the 1920 and the 1940 census, in Portland, sometimes the 1910 will also have it. They will put the house number in the street name, which is really, really wonderful to have too. When I talk about census records, I always want to be sure to talk about a portion of the census records that people may not know about, and those are the census schedules. There's one for agriculture and one for industry, and those were done in 1860, 1870, and 1880. I'm showing you the one from 1880. This is one of the pages within the city of Deering. You wouldn't think about Deering as having necessarily an agricultural schedule, because we think about Deering as being kind of the suburban built up area that we know it today, but there was a lot of agriculture going on in Deering, and I always encourage people to check the agricultural schedule, because you'll be amazed at the information that this provides, particularly the 1880 version. George Radcliffe, which is the first line that I've highlighted here, he had 5 acres of land. So it wasn't a huge farm, but 5 acres that he kept tilled. And it has the value of his farm, $3,000. It talks about the labor that he had on the farm, how many acres of his farm were fenced in. And then it also records how many horses, how many cows, did he have any pigs or poultry. In this case, he did. He had 15 hens that laid 160 dozen eggs. So it records fairly specific material. There's also a column on orchards. We see a lot of that in Deering as well. The site where the house that I was doing the deed research for, the 447 Deering Avenue, was actually built on land owned by H.Q. Wheeler. That was a 9-acre parcel that eventually got subdivided. And so you can learn more about what was going on that parcel as well. So I'd encourage you to look for those if you're doing census research. Likewise, there's a schedule for industry. If you're researching, I think this is particularly useful if you are researching a specific brick building, because they call out separately the masons in a community. So if you're in a smaller residential community, say like Gorham, there's probably 2 or 3 masons. And maybe one of them, if you look on the map surrounding your house, you can say, oh, that mason lived just down the street about the time that my brick house was being built. And you can kind of get an assumption that, or an estimate that your brick house may have been built by that mason. But there are all different kinds of industries, chair manufacturers, boot manufacturers, that are documented in the industry section. And it may be that you're researching somebody who that was their occupation, and you can learn more about their business. This is where it says brick mason. This is an example of the brick mason's schedule in 1870. So going back to that deed research that we did earlier, I talked a little bit about that we named the house the Center House because, and not the Mitchell House, even though when Arthur Mitchell owned it, there was a house on the lot. We know that from the sentence in the deed that says that Mitchell was selling a house and buildings and land rather. And, but by using street directory research, we know that Arthur Mitchell actually lived in the neighborhood. He didn't actually live in this house. I mentioned that Ancestry is currently free. The way that you can get to that is listed on the left-hand side of the screen. It's librarydigitalmain.org/subject/genealogy. And you can click the button and it will take you to Ancestry free, or you can get an account. I have one, we have one at the office. And Family Search is the other search engine that's really helpful as well. Don't have as much data, but they have a lot of very similar data. If you do an ancestry search, you can find out lots of different information. This is what a search return window looks like. Because we knew that the first occupant was this Llewellyn Center, we wanted to learn more about him. We typed in his name. We said that he lived in Portland. I always start with Portland, even if they lived in Deering, because Ancestry, for some reason, does know that Deering and Portland were tied together. And actually, it's kind of the algorithm that the database uses brings up, after it runs through all the ones that it thinks are the most exact, it brings up the ones that they think are the next most exact. So it would bring up Westbrook or Falmouth or Cumberland or other places in Maine, and then it will go to like New York, New Jersey, or other communities. So it is the algorithm is pretty good in this. So even if you're typing in Portland and it was really Deering or Westbrook at the time, you're likely to see the right return. So here you can see there's a 1910 census record for Llewellyn Center. In 1930, there's some marriage records, a 1940 census, a 1920 census, and there's also this one that I want to talk a little bit about, which is the Find a Grave Index. We can see that that's giving us a birth and death date and a location, which can tell you a little bit more about them. And then if you click on the link, this actually takes you to a separate site, which you can search for free without Ancestry. You can just go to findagrave.com and put in search criteria. They have their own search engine, but it is tied into Ancestry, which is nice. And you can get a little bit more information about him. A lot of this information is done by people who are surveying the cemeteries, and they often include a photograph so you can see the stone for yourself. And if there is somebody else on the stone that they can easily identify as a family member, they record that as well. And then that is, it's a linkable click. You can click on Adelaide's name, his wife, and it will take you to her information. Sometimes when you have, a family plot, it'll have a lot of information about their children, maybe their parents-in-law. You can find a lot of really good vital information by using Find a Grave. It's one of my favorite sites to use. It's quick and it's well laid out, and the search engine seems to work really well, particularly for the cemeteries in Portland like Evergreen. So from using all of these sources, we were able to find out that Llewellyn was actually married twice. He was married first to Cora Clifford in 1884. She died 2 years later. Her death record is on Ancestry.com. She died of gastric fever. It's a little ghoulish, but it is very interesting to look at the different terminology that they used in earlier years. I have to do a lot of searching, like what kind of medical condition was that, to find out what it maybe means now in the 21st century. His second marriage was to Adelaide Rose, who lived in this house with him. They got married in March of 1894, and looking at his deed, he bought the house in January of 1894. So it seems to me clearly he was anticipating his marriage and purchased this new house for his upcoming new wife. From U.S. Census records, we were able to identify his parents. We know that he was a retail grocer. From different census records, we know that his sister-in-law and father-in-law often lived with him, and after Adelaide died, he continued to live with his sister-in-law until they moved to a new house, also within the neighborhood at 85 Glenwood. And then using the city directories, we were able to find out what the name of where he was a grocer. And he actually had his own grocery store right in the neighborhood at 642 Forest Avenue, called the LP Center and Company store. And going back to the 1924 tax records, looking at 642 to 644 Forest Avenue, we actually have a picture of his grocery store there's his name right there on the signboard. And that building, of course, today still exists. It's kind of the backside of where Bayou Kitchen was. And I mentioned very early on when I was talking that we've been doing some research on the Chinese community in Portland in the 1920s. Right next door to Mr. Center's store was a Chinese laundry. And you can see the little laundry sign is actually right here in this 1924 image. There are different eras of death certificates and birth records, and so you'll find a different amount of information on all of these as you look at them. Some have more information than others. Sometimes they will give you the parent's name. Sometimes there won't be any parents. So it's kind of hit or miss depending on which era you're getting the records from. If you don't use Ancestry, but you are looking for vital records, you can look for the main marriage records. something happened to the marriage records between 1966 and 1977, which happens to be a period when my parents were born. And they didn't used to have that there was a gap. And when I first started doing doing vital records research when I was much younger, I said to my mother, "Are you and Dad really married? Because you're not in the main marriage record file." And she did give me their marriage records. I was indeed not born out of wedlock. And the other thing that I want to mention is the military records. This can be incredibly interesting if you're really deep diving into some of the owners of your property. I've been doing just genealogy research for my family. We have one family where 3 of the brothers were in the Civil War. Was able to find out which campaigns they were on by knowing what division and what regiment they were with. It's been really interesting. The other thing is on my mom's side of the family, one of her uncles was a prisoner of war, which I knew. In Germany, he was captured by the Germans. I actually, as delved more into the military records and more of the information became available, I found out that he was actually captured in Tunisia, taken to Germany when the Allies were getting close to liberating his prisoner of war camp. He was force marched with all the other prisoners of war for 3 days until finally they were liberated. Unfortunately, he suffered from a great amount of PTSD, and not long after coming home, he did kill himself. But it was really interesting to find out more about what he might have had to live through and understanding that. So I would encourage you to always check out the military records if you see those for somebody that you're doing research on. You can learn a lot of information. And there are some local histories. If you're dealing with other communities, there are local histories that have some genealogy usually included in them as well. In Portland, there are a whole lots of books about the history of Portland, so I am not going to include those here. But I would encourage you to check them out because they help put the people you're researching and the era and the time period that you're researching into context, which I think can be helpful. The other thing a lot of people don't think to do is to, when you're doing a Google search, to click on, instead of all or news, you can also do books, Google Books. And Google Books has a lot of Board of Trade journals, books that are called the Sketches of Representative Men or Women in New England, and annual reports that were filed to the state of Maine by various industries. And you can find out some interesting information there. One of the things that I was able to find on Mr. Center was this interior photo from a Chamber of Commerce journal of Maine in 1907. There's an interior photo of his store on Forest Avenue, of his confectionery and bakery department at LP Center and Company, which I think is really wonderful. Sometimes you'll find a picture of the men, particularly in those sketches of representative men and women. Sometimes you'll find an image of the person you're researching. People are always excited to know if their house was designed by an architect. Sadly, the answer is it's very difficult to know. There's not very good records on which homes were architecturally designed. You know, lots of people in the West End want to know if they have a John Calvin Stevens. Somebody like John Calvin Stevens is more well documented than other architects practicing in Portland. The Maine Historical Society has a really fairly good collection of drawings, and they have been recently awarded a grant to digitize more of those drawings. Very few of them are currently online in their main memory network system, but more of them will be coming online in the next year or 2, or maybe 3, depending on how long the process takes, which is very exciting. And then I would encourage everyone to do what we do, is to take all that information that you find and put it together and create a document. We do this as part of our marker program. We have a higher level of the marker program where we kind of do this deeper dig of research, and we pull it all together and give you this brochure. It's something that you know, realtors like to do as kind of a housewarming present. It's nice to leave house. You could have this information to pass on to the next owner. And so I encourage you to think about doing something like that. And that's what I have. Here on the left-hand side, you can see that's my email. I'm more than happy because I love to play detective. If you do come across some research and you hit a brick wall and you can't get any further, and you just need to talk to somebody about where you are and ask for some suggestions on how you might work around that wall to get to the answer that you're looking for, you know, I'm happy to respond by email. I won't probably always respond the day you email me, but I will try to reach out to you and help you figure out the story of your house.